Good morning. Well, as you have just seen, the new 8 panels have been installed, and the difference is quite noticeable. I've seen peak system power output hit 9.3 kilowatts, and that's downstream from the inverters. I'll dive into that installation in a bit. That's the first of 4 sections in this video. Second, a few thoughts on life without a battery. My system shut down in February, a failed circuit board in the system controller. Enphase replaced it, but it took a couple of weeks. My installer reconfigured the controller so I would still have my panel output, but no battery storage for the duration. That's something I want to repeat. Third, my system was restored just in time to cope with a string of atmospheric rivers impacting California, an unusually chilly and wet gray spring. I'll show you how my enhanced system coped with that. And finally, I brought my pottery studio back online. Did my upgraded solar system have enough power and energy to fire my kiln twice? Installing the 8 panels was straightforward and took less than a day, since the rest of the system was already in place. The first thing the crew did was to lay out the position of the panels and mark that on the roof. Then find and mark the location of the trusses under the roof. Can't screw the mounting rails into plywood. They knew my trusses, or rafters, were spaced every 24 inches for guidance. And you can tap with a hammer and listen for the thud you get when you're directly above solid wood. Once marked out, the rail supports were installed. These have a base that acts like a shingle to keep the water out. Then the rails are attached to the supports and aligned to ensure the panel array will be perfectly flat. There are slots in the rails, on the side for fastening them to the supports, and on top for clamping on the panels. I'm using microinverters in lieu of string inverters. There is one microinverter for every panel. They convert the direct current from the panel into the 240 volt alternating current used by the house. The microinverters I selected have a peak output power capacity of 300 watts. So when the 400 watt rated panels are producing at their peak output, the microinverters clip the excess power. However, panels rarely, if ever, produce their rated capacity due to several factors, including off-angle solar alignment and loss of efficiency due to heat, which can be as much as 15% on hot summer days. Higher power microinverters are, of course, available, but they cost more. And the total energy loss from clipping is on the order of a couple of percent during the first year, approaching zero as panel output degrades with time. Except during the middle of perfectly clear days, the 300 watt microinverters will handle all the panel output. But on those perfect days, my system is already capable of producing much more energy than I can use, so higher power inverters would not benefit. However, if you can sell your midday power back to the grid at a good price, they might be worthwhile. With the microinverters attached to the slotted rails, the panels can be lifted into place, plugged into the microinverters, and fastened down with these edge clamps. The cable for the whole array's output was routed through conduit into a terminal box, into the attic, and through a PVC conduit to the other end of the house, where it went into the combiner to join with the output from the other 24 panels. The power then is routed into the system controller. While more and more people are choosing to install battery storage along with solar panels, most people still elect to go with panels alone for lower cost and less complexity. With net metering, that is, sending excess solar power back to the grid in exchange for credit, solar customers are essentially using the utility to store the excess power they generate. Some people choose not to participate in net metering agreements, like myself, and others are not given the opportunity to send excess power back to the grid, for example in Hawaii. Under recent net metering changes, the credits many utilities give you for your excess midday energy may not come close to what you have to pay them for the energy you take back during peak periods. In these situations, having battery storage can make a dramatic difference in how much of your produced energy you can fully benefit from. Your solar panels supply power roughly 8 hours each day. Energy you use during the other 16 hours has to come from someplace else, either the grid or a battery. In the summer, when air conditioning demands are highest during the day, not having a battery will be less important. When it's cold, however, especially if you have a heat pump, your energy demand during the darkness will be significant. Recently, I experienced solar without a battery. After my system controller failed, it took Enphase 15 days to replace the bad circuit board. During that period, I still had the use of my solar panels, but my batteries were offline. I had to rely on grid power during the darkness, and that cost me more than $100 for just the 15 nights, mostly to run my efficient heat pump. I charged my car and did laundry during the day, of course, on solar power. So glad when I regained use of my batteries. So the main question this video is supposed to resolve is, did the 8 extra panels provide enough overhead to power through a succession of challenging weather days? The short answer is, so far, so good. I'm really happy with the extra power. Instead of just meeting daytime energy requirements on cloudy, rainy days, the new 32-panel system is also charging the battery to good levels, in most cases back up to 100%. The system is then well positioned to make it through a following overcast day, instead of having the battery discharge lower and lower. While the original 24-panel array first had to meet the immediate requirements of the house during the day before applying any excess power to the batteries, the output of the added 8 panels generally can all be used to charge the battery. Makes a big difference. In other words, if you don't have a battery, you just want enough panels to meet your immediate daytime needs. But if you do have a battery, you're going to need more panels, maybe even twice as many, in order to also charge that battery. For me, 32 panels appears to be about the right number. The only caveat is that this test occurred late February into March, more than 2 months after the shortest day of the year. So the extra daylight was also providing a boost. We'll see what happens next December. But back to the challenge of this year's recurrent atmospheric rivers. The compelling value of the 8 additional panels has been on those mostly cloudy days when the original 24 panels were able to produce significant energy, just not quite enough to charge the battery to a high level. February 23rd and March 1st were 2 examples of the extra panels making a big difference. A half-inch of rain fell on February 23rd, starting during the morning, with some midday breaks in the dark clouds boosting the panel output, followed by more rain. The battery charge made it back up to 100% by mid-afternoon. March 1 started with steady rain and thick cloud cover, with a few bright spots in the clouds during the day, ending with hail. Don't see much of that here. Again, battery charge was pushed up to 100% during the afternoon, which was fortunate because the temperature that night went down to freezing, and with the heat pump working overtime, the battery charge by 7 a.m. the next morning had dropped to 54%. On both of those days, battery charge managed to make it up to 100%, putting the system in a good place for the following day. The 8 extra panels made a significant difference. Compare that to a day before the 8 panels were added. On a dismal December 31st, with just the 24 panels, the system could not significantly raise the battery charge during the day. So a night of powering the heat pump meant the battery charge dropped to 40% by morning. Fortunately, the January 1st weather was mixed, so the battery charge recovered somewhat, but only managed to reach 79%. Had it been overcast all day, grid power would have been needed. So the 32-panel system will restore the batteries charged over the course of a mixed weather day. But how will it perform if given full sun all day? Let's look at March 2nd, where the battery charge started out at 54% after that cold night. While it took most of an overcast March 1st to make it up to 100%, the bright sun on March 2nd raised the 54% to 100% charge by late morning. Sustained system power output peaked at more than 9 kilowatts. There were about 3 hours after the battery finished charging when I was not using all this excess capacity before I plugged my car in. Here are a few other examples of how the system fared with low energy days. March 10th started overcast with drizzle, then rain all afternoon. A relatively low 16.5 kilowatt-hour energy production day, when the battery was not restored to full charge, but good enough. The next day was almost equally gloomy, overcast with drizzle pretty much the whole day. No sun at all, but there was some spotty lightening in the cloud cover midday, raising panel output for that period to about half of what full sun would yield, for a respectable total energy output for the day of 22.2 kilowatt hours, about a quarter of what full sun would have yielded. Despite that, battery charged almost made it back to 100%. March 15th was a low energy day, with just 14.6 kilowatt hours production. Heavy rain overnight and in the morning. By 10:30 a.m., more than 3 inches of rain had fallen since the day before. The rain ended around 11 a.m., turning to drizzle for the rest of the day. The panel energy output just managed to raise battery charge to 87%, which was enough. Fortunately, the battery charge made it up to 100% the rainy day before, which was only a 19.2 kilowatt hour day, in large part because the good weather day before that charged the battery to 100%. The important point here is that the extra panel energy benefit is cumulative over a period of days. Up to now, I've cited charging the house and car batteries as the biggest draws on the solar system energy output, and to a lesser extent the clothes dryer. But if I run the car battery down, I can always charge it partway one day and then finish it up another day. So actually not a daunting challenge. There is, however, a much more demanding consumer of electricity in my house, and that's my pottery kiln. Not used a lot, but when it gets turned on, it sucks a lot of power for 12 hours straight. Before we turn on the power though, here's a look at how pots are made. Start with a ball of clay. Stick it firmly on the wheel, sealed around the edge so water can't get underneath it. Then it has to be perfectly centered. It won't work if it's lumpy. The surface of the clay is kept wet and slippery. If it dries out, it will stick to your hand and the piece will self-destruct. Squeeze the clay to cone up. The centering takes place when you then push it down, constrained by the heel of your right hand. You do this several times. Then the clay is opened up. The thick walls are pulled up, thinning them in the process. Since this piece will be a T-bowl, the walls are pushed out from the inside with a curved rib. Ribs come in metal, plastic, or wood varieties. The rim is smoothed with a piece of chamois. A metal rib smooths the outside, removing the layer of soft, watery clay called slip. After the piece is dried out for a while, the bottom can be trimmed. I made 8 pieces for this test, about a half load for my kiln. They will be fired twice. First, a 12.5-hour bisque fire to give the fragile pots enough strength to be glazed, and then a hotter, faster glaze fire. I turned on the kiln at 8 on a foggy morning. After 6.5 hours, the temperature had reached almost 1100 degrees, on its way up to 1830 degrees Fahrenheit, or almost 1000 degrees C. The firing lasted 12 hours and 40 minutes, ending at 8:45 p.m., and powered largely from the batteries for the last 3 hours. That dropped the charge down to 68%. The total energy consumption for the day was 45 kilowatt hours. Besides the kiln, I only used electricity for hot water, the oven for chocolate, cranberry, banana nut bread, and some electronics, so I'm guessing the kiln consumed around 40 kilowatt hours of energy. Toward the end, the kiln was throwing off a lot of heat. The maximum average power used by the kiln was 4 kilowatts, less than half of what my solar panels can produce, under the yellow line in the chart. So energy use was not ideal. Had I started the kiln 2 hours earlier, at 6 a.m., the kiln would initially have been fed by the battery, which would have been replenished by the ample sunshine later in the day. The firing would then have finished at 6:45 p.m., using little battery energy at the end of the day. As it was, battery charge by the next morning had dropped to 48%, but increased to 100% by the end of the day, even though there was no sun, thanks to the new panels. Alternatively, in lieu of the 12.5-hour slow temperature ramp, I could have used the higher power 7.5-hour medium ramp, which would likely have finished by around 4 p.m. I'm going to use the medium ramp for the higher energy glaze firing. I initially started that glaze fire on a sunny May 7th at 8 a.m. The battery charge at that time was 88%, and the panels were producing 4.5 kilowatts. By 9 a.m., the battery was back up to 100%. By noon, after a few false starts, the kiln temperature had risen to 1,050 degrees Fahrenheit, on its way up to 2,232 degrees Fahrenheit, or 1,222 degrees centigrade, which it reached at 5:30. The kiln's computer cycled the full 33 amp power draw on and off to achieve a smooth temperature ramp. A small fan moves a little clean air through the kiln and more air through the room, exhausting it through the wall. I also use a more powerful exhaust fan in the ceiling to keep the room temperature in check. The average maximum power used for the glaze firing was about 5.7 kilowatts, compared to the 4 kilowatts for the bisque firing. In the end, the kiln consumed about the same amount of energy as the bisque firing, a surprise to me. I'm guessing the extra energy needed to achieve the higher glaze temperature was balanced by the greater waste heat during the hours longer bisque firing. So I guess that means my off-grid system passed the kiln test. Well, it's almost 24 hours after the kiln turned off, and it's finally cooled enough to discover how the glaze turned out, because you just never know. The finished pots never look anything like they did when you first brushed the glaze on. Here's the before and the after. And here's the tea bowl you first saw as a ball of clay. Hey, thanks for watching.